The horrors of the Second World War are etched into the imagination of public discourse. But what of its aftermath? How does a continent at war for 6 years and unstable for much longer create peace when so many national, ideological and social resentments remain? It's easy to forget that a military victory for the Allies didn't mean that a defeated people's attitudes and ideologies suddenly changed. And World War II was not just a military conflict. So many in Europe let their resentment be unleashed on their ideological or ethnic enemies, whether from the same state or not. To think then that the end of the war means the end of resentment is naive. In the Soviet Union, 70,000 villages and 1,700 towns were destroyed by the Nazis during the war, and 16 million people died, over 15% of its population. But when the Nazis were defeated and the Soviets occupied Berlin at the beginning of May 1945, retribution had already begun. In Vienna alone, which the Soviets had taken by the beginning of April, some 87,000 women were reported by doctors to have been raped by Soviet soldiers. In Berlin, the numbers were even higher. Throughout 1945, the citizens of Vienna lived on just 800 calories a day. It was already clear that the post-war period was going to be almost as horrific as the war, but in different and unexpected ways. Countries in Eastern Europe expelled all Germans living there and confiscated their property, but the defeat of the Nazis didn't mean anti-Semitism went away. Anti-Semitism wasn't a German phenomenon, it was a European and a global one. Between 1948 and 1951, 332,000 Jews emigrated to Israel. But when the horrors of anti-Semitism and fascism were at their height and France and much of Eastern Europe was under occupation, there was always some optimism. Most countries had some form of underground resistance. But personal indignation, ideological bitterness, and the psychology of submission to an invading oppressor, what the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre likened to the kind of sadomasochism of sexual submission, meant that incidents of neighbours reporting their own neighbours to the Nazis was disturbingly high. In the aftermath of the war, formerly occupied nations would ask themselves difficult questions. What did resistance mean, and what did collaboration mean? Retribution towards the Nazis through the Nuremberg trials is well known. But as governments busied themselves attempting to fix a broken and desperate Europe, people, communities, neighbours, they all wanted revenge. During occupation, some slept with Nazis, some worked with them, some welcomed them, some out of support, some out of destitution. The situation was not only difficult, it was, of course, desperate. When the revenge on these collaborators began after the war, it was merciless. In France, some 10,000 were killed in extrajudicial executions by bands of local resistors. In Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, many more were lynched and murdered. In Norway, 55,000 members of a pro-Nazi organisation were tried, and in the Netherlands, 100,000 were sent to prison. In Belgium, almost 3,000 were sentenced to death, but only 242 were carried out. Czechoslovakia sentenced 713 to death, 741 to life in prison, and almost 20,000 shorter sentences. Austria had 700,000 Nazi Party members in a country of only 7 million. Only 13,600 of them were sent to prison. In a country where Nazism was so entrenched, Austria had to distinguish between lower and higher Nazis so as not to tear the entire country apart. But it was the French that had complicated questions to ask. The state itself, Vichy France, collaborated with the Nazis as a puppet state. Vichy France deported 76,000 Jews to the extermination camps, But authors like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre edited, published, or contributed to underground resistance newspapers like Combat. One, maybe apocryphal story, tells of a German officer visiting Picasso's studio in Paris. Picasso offered him a postcard of Guernica, his famous painting of fascist bombing during the Spanish Civil War. "Did you do this?" the officer asked. "No, you did," Picasso replied. In France, as this infamous image taken by photojournalist Robert Capa shows, women's heads were shaved as punishment for having liaisons with the Nazis. This punishment has a long history in Europe, and the resistance threatened collaborators with it through the underground press. When a place was liberated, punishment was swift. Many were shorn in groups in public squares, then marched through the streets, stripped and marked with swastikas. Around 20,000 women had their heads shaved in France. We can see why the historian Stanley Hoffmann distinguishes between two types of collaboration. Collaboration for the benefit and survival of France and the French people, a practical and sometimes necessary collaboration, and collaborationism with Nazis in the sense of cooperation, for personal gain or political affinity. The latter, of course, must be judged more harshly. One, though, can quickly turn to the other. This, of course, doesn't even begin to look at the question of how the Allies were to denazify Germany. In the city of Bonn, for example, 102 out of 112 doctors alone had been registered Nazi members. In 1946, 37% of Germans answered in a questionnaire yes, that the extermination of Jews and other non-Aryans was necessary for the security of Germans. In 1952, 25% of Germans still had a good opinion of Hitler. In all, 100,000 Germans were convicted across Europe, less than the total convictions for collaborations in other countries. So, with collaboration so widespread, as the historian Tony Judd has pointed out, the need for Europe to forget the extent of fascist sympathy quickly superseded the need for retaliation. By the end of the 1950s, there were hardly any Nazis remaining in prison across Europe at all. Sartre wrote of France that the whole country both resisted and collaborated. Everything we did was equivocal. We never quite knew whether we were doing right or wrong. A subtle poison corrupted even our best actions.
The World War II started on 1st September 1939 and ended on the 2nd of September 1945, exactly 6 years and 1 day. There were several major events leading up to the war and then during the war as well. So here's a timeline listing some of the major events. January 30, 1933. Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, his Nazi party or the Third Reich takes power and Hitler is essentially the dictator of Germany. October 25, 1936, Rome-Berlin Axis. Coalition formed in 1936 between Italy and Germany. An agreement formulated by Italy's foreign minister Galeazzo Ciano informally linking the two fascist countries was reached on October 25, 1936. It was formalized by the Pact of Steel in 1939, and the term Axis powers came to include Japan as well. November 25, 1936, Anti-Comintern Pact. Agreement concluded first between Germany and Japan and then between Italy, Germany, and Japan. Ostensibly directed against the Communist International, but by implication specifically against the Soviet Union. July 7, 1937, Japan invades China. A clash occurred between Chinese and Japanese troops near Peiping in North China. March 12, 1938, Anschluss. Hitler annexes the country of Austria into Germany. This is also called the Anschluss. September 1st, 1939, World War II begins. The German army under Adolf Hitler launched an invasion of Poland that triggered the start of World War II. The battle for Poland only lasted for about a month before a Nazi victory, but the invasion plunged the world into war that would continue for almost 6 years and claim the lives of tens of thousands of people. September 3rd, 1939, France and Great Britain declare war on Germany. In response to Hitler's invasion of Poland, Britain and France, both allies of the overrun nation, declare war on Germany. May 10th, June 22nd, 1940, Germany invades Norway and Denmark. German warships enters major Norwegian ports from Narvik to Oslo, deploying thousands of German troops and occupying Norway. At the same time, German forces occupy Copenhagen, among other Danish cities. In Denmark, King Christian X, convinced his army could not fight off a German invasion, and surrendered almost immediately. Hitler now added a second and third conquered nation to his quarry, which began with Poland. 26 May to 4 June 1940, Battle of Dunkirk. The Battle of Dunkirk was fought in Dunkirk, France during the Second World War between the Allies and Nazi Germany. As the Allies were losing the Battle of France on the Western Front, the Battle of Dunkirk was the defense and evacuation to Britain of British and other Allied forces in Europe from May 26 to 4 June 1940. May 30th, 1940, Winston Churchill becomes the leader of the British government. Winston Churchill, a British politician, army officer, and a writer, was also the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, when he led Britain to victory in the Second World War, and again from 1951 to 1955. June 10, 1940, Axis alliance. After withholding formal allegiance to either side in the battle between Germany and the Allies, Benito Mussolini, dictator of Italy, declares war on France and Great Britain. The three principal partners in the Axis alliance were Germany, Italy, and Japan. These three countries recognized German domination over most of continental Europe, Italian domination over the Mediterranean Sea, and Japanese domination over East Asia and the Pacific. July 10th to October 31st, 1940, Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was a military campaign of the Second World War in which the Royal Air Force defended the United Kingdom against large-scale attacks by Nazi Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe. It has been described as the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces. The British officially recognized the battle's duration about 3 months and 3 weeks, which overlaps the period of large-scale night attacks known as the Blitz that lasted from 7 September 1940 to 11 May 1941. September 22, 1940, the Tripartite Pact. Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, creating the Axis alliance. June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Adolf Hitler launched his armies eastward in a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 great army groups with about 3 to 4 million German soldiers, 150 divisions, and 3,000 tanks smashed across the frontier into Soviet territory. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise preemptive military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service upon the United States against the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, territory of Hawaii, just before 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. The attack led to the United States' formal entry into World War II the next day. The Japanese military leadership referred to this attack as the Hawaii Operation and Operation AI. June 4, 1942, Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was a decisive naval battle in the Pacific theater of World War II that took place on 4 to 7 June 1942, 6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States Navy under Admirals Chester W. Nimitz, Frank J. Fletcher, and Raymond A. Spruance defeated an attacking fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy under Admirals Isoroku Yamamoto, Chuichi Nagumo, and Nobutake Kondo under Midway Atoll, inflicting devastating damage on the Japanese fleet that proved irreparable. Military historian John Keegan called it the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. July 10, 1943, Allied invasion of Sicily. The Allies began their invasion of Axis-controlled Europe with landings on the island of Sicily off mainland Italy. Encountering little resistance from the demoralized Sicilian troops, the British Eighth Army under Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery came ashore on the southeast of the island, while the U.S. Seventh Army under General George S. Patton landed on Sicily's south coast. Within 3 days, 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. September 3, 1943, Armistice of Cassable. The Armistice of Cassel was an armistice signed on 3 September 1943 by Walter Battle Smith and Giuseppe Castellano and made public on 8 September between the Kingdom of Italy and the Allies during World War II. The armistice stipulated the surrender of Italy to the Allies. June 6, 1944, D-Day. On 6 June 1944, the Allied forces of Britain, America, Canada, and France attacked German forces on the coast of Normandy, France. With a huge force of over 150,000 soldiers, the Allies attacked and gained a victory that became the turning point for World War II in Europe. This famous battle is sometimes called the D-Day or the Invasion of Normandy. August 25, 1944, Liberation of Paris. The liberation of Paris was a military battle that took place during World War II from 19 August 1944 until the German garrison surrendered the French capital on 25 August 1944. Paris had been ruled by Nazi Germany since the signing of the Second Compiègne Armistice on 22 June 1940, after which the Wehrmacht occupied northern and western France. December 16, 1944, Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge, also known as the Ardennes Counteroffensive, was the last major German offensive campaign on the Western Front during the World War II. It was launched through the densely forested region of Wallonia in eastern Belgium, northeast France and Luxembourg towards the end of the war in Europe. February 19, 1945, Battle of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a major battle in which the United States Marine Corps and Navy landed on and eventually captured the island of Iwo Jima from the Imperial Japanese Army during the World War II. March 23, 1945, Operation Plunder. Operation Plunder was a military operation to cross the River Rhine of Germany on the night of 23 March 1945 under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The crossing of the river was at Rees, Wissel, and south of the River Lippe by the British Second Army and the United States Ninth Army, leading to the Allied victory. April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. Holed up in a bunker under his headquarters in Berlin, Adolf Hitler commits suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule and shooting himself in the head. Soon after, Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allied forces, ending Hitler's dreams of a 1,000-year Reich. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. An American B-29 bomber dropped the world's first deployed atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The code name of the atom bomb is called Little Boy, and the explosion wiped out 90% of the city and immediately killed 80,000 people. August 9, 1945, Nagasaki. A second atom bomb codenamed Fat Man is dropped on Japan by the United States at Nagasaki, resulting finally in Japan's unconditional surrender. The number killed is estimated at anywhere between 60,000 to 80,000 people. September 2, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrenders to the Allies, bringing an end to World War II. So with this, we've come to the end of our video, but before you go, please don't forget to smash that like button and that subscribe button. Thank you so much for viewing in, we hope you've enjoyed this video. See you again in our next video.
This video is brought to you by Captivating History. World War II is the most devastating and in most cases the cruelest conflict in human history. If we look at it from our current perspective, it seems unthinkable that anyone would intentionally launch such a devastating war. It may surprise you to hear that it was just as shocking to many people at the time as well. Parts of the world, Europe in particular, had yet to recover from the horrors of the First World War. Millions had vowed that they would never get sucked into another global conflict, and yet 2 decades later, it happened again. For years, historians treated the causes of World War II as separate from the causes of its predecessor. However, the lead-ups to the First and Second World Wars are inseparably linked. When Germany was united in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 to 1872, it immediately cemented into a rich and powerful country. However, its late arrival meant that it did not gain the prestige and power it believed the nation deserved. It was kept out of the major trade networks and could not expand its colonial holdings. In short, Kaiser Wilhelm and the German government felt they had been disrespected. German frustration was only one cause of World War I, but it was a crucial one. However, the Wilhelmine bid to gain more influence failed, and the Entente powers in the war defeated them. But that only exacerbated the gap between German self-perception and their actual stature in the world. The Great War, as it was called at the time, was incredibly costly for the victors. They also blamed the Germans entirely for the outbreak of the war, even though there were other important causes. Therefore, the winning side, especially Britain and France, was hungry for revenge. As a result, the peace agreement that ended that war focused far more on punishing Germany than constructing a sustainable peace agreement. Therefore, the agreement included several causes that most Germans considered humiliating. The victors were not satisfied with blaming the defeated party for the war. They also sought compensation and forced Berlin to pay war reparations. The amounts of money involved were crippling, and France also demanded wildly excessive quantities of coal that were difficult for the vanquished party to provide. Perhaps most painfully, parts of Germany were stripped away and handed over to other countries. However, the United States worked to defang the agreement somewhat. Through their insistence, Germany was allowed to rebuild its economy and retain sovereignty. They also allowed the defeated side to maintain a small but potent military force. The peace agreement was poorly designed. It was not forgiving enough to bring Germany into the fold. However, it was not harsh enough to prevent the defeated nation from rebuilding and ultimately taking revenge. American President Woodrow Wilson identified some of the leading causes of World War I and aimed to prevent their recurrence. One measure he suggested was creating a League of Nations, not too different from the modern United Nations, which would help states resolve their conflicts. However, the enterprise was doomed from the start. Wilson was in the process of selling the idea to Congress and the American public when he fell victim to a stroke. The motion to join the international organization was defeated. The League released feeble condemnations when Germany repeatedly violated the Versailles Treaty. Japan ran amok in Manchuria, and Italy invaded Abyssinia. The neutered League of Nations was unable to prevent future conflicts. Rather than obey it or even respect it, nations such as Japan and Germany left the organization and ignored its resolutions. Germany was already a partial democracy before World War I. However, after the conflict, they adopted a fully democratic system with a capital in the city of Weimar. However, the catastrophic events of World War I had undermined faith in liberal democracy throughout the world. Many turned to communism, while others feared the specter of nationalization and redistribution and turned to fascism instead. Like many other countries, Weimar Germany was caught between both forces. Despite the reparations and rise of ideological extremism, the Weimar Republic limped on until the Great Depression. The ensuing inflation and poverty engulfed Germany and led to the demise of the regime. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took advantage of the weakness of the Weimar government and blamed reparations for the state of the German economy. He also exploited the fear of communism and anti-Semitism prevalent amongst the middle class to cement support. These factors allowed the Nazis to pursue a policy of unparalleled racist expansionism. By the time Hitler and the Nazis had come to power, many citizens and leaders in the liberal democracies recognized the inequities of the Versailles Treaty. Indeed, the shock of seeing virulent nationalism and anti-Semitism take over the country hastened the long overdue recognition. This belated, though accurate, recognition ended up being problematic. The oppressive clauses of the agreement had unfairly burdened the Weimar Republic. The former Entente powers should have recognized the need to strengthen that government. However, once the Nazis were in power, the democracies required a strong policy to counter their ambitions. Instead, they laid down their guard and attempted to satisfy Hitler's demands to avoid war. The British policy was particularly problematic. Hitler made escalating demands and moves in the 1930s to strengthen the German military and territorial position. Though he had written his entire manifesto for massive expansionism in the book Mein Kampf, the leadership in London believed this was posturing. Successive governments, particularly the one led by Neville Chamberlain, turned a blind eye to increased German provocations. At first, the demands of the Nazi Führer seemed to fall under the category of revanchism, defined as the desire to reverse territorial losses. In 1936, the German military remilitarized the industrial Ruhr area in violation of the Versailles Treaty. The French and the paralyzed League of Nations' lack of reaction encouraged Hitler to continue his policy of brinkmanship. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria, which had never been part of it. However, many observers accepted it, as Austria and Germany shared a language and many cultural similarities. World War II was fought on two major fronts, the European theater and the Pacific one. Correspondingly, both areas played an important role in causing the conflict. Just like Germany, Japan was dissatisfied with the peace agreements ending World War I. They had fought, ironically enough, against Wilhelmine Germany. However, the sacrifices of the Japanese were not recognized by the Allies. A combination of frustration with their position in the world and the 1929 stock market crash's fallout pushed Japan towards a militaristic regime. Unwilling to continue to exist at the mercy of Western colonialism and their monopoly on trade, the island nation embarked on a mission to secure the resources and territory needed to establish their empire. Starting in 1931, the Japanese increased their influence in Manchuria, a province of China. By 1937, they refused to recognize Chinese sovereignty and launched a full-scale war against their larger neighbors. In 1938, Hitler pushed to annex the Sudetenland, a mountainous region in Czechoslovakia. Though ethnic Germans populated the area, it was essential for Czechoslovakian national security. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier negotiated with the Nazi government in Munich, agreeing to the German annexation of the area. The Führer agreed, formally waiving all future demands on the rest of the country. Chamberlain returned to England and announced he had made peace for our time. However, Hitler flagrantly violated the agreement. In March 1939, German troops marched into Prague and put an end to Czechoslovakian independence. The French and British knew they had been duped and prepared for war. The Soviet Union had been a close ally of Czechoslovakia. However, when the Western Allies abandoned the country, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin adjusted his foreign policy. Moscow decided to sign a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, doing so on August 23, 1939. That cleared the final and most blatant German provocation. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland on a flimsy pretext. By this point, no one believed their rationalizations. Both London and Paris declared war on Nazi Germany. The British and French policy of appeasement played a significant role in paving the road to war. However, more than anything else, it was the gaping open wound of World War I that guaranteed a grim sequel. To learn more about the history of World War II, check out our book, World War II, a captivating guide from beginning to end. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook.
It is the largest armed conflict that humanity has known. A deadly war that involved tens of millions of fighters around the world. Let's retrace on a map a summary of the main events of World War II. At the end of World War I, Germany and its allies are defeated and held solely responsible for the war. With heavy sanctions imposed upon them, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires are dismantled, while Germany has to repay what many consider an unreasonable debt. Its colonies and some of its territories are ceded to the victors and to Poland, which is recreated. These sanctions are seen as humiliation by the German people. The German economy is weakened by excessive debt and suffers hyperinflation. National mints try to address this by printing banknotes, causing a devaluation of its currency. Between 1914 and November 1923, the value of the mark grew by 1,000 billion. The following year, radical measures are taken to halt inflation and stabilize and revive the economy. But in 1929, the Wall Street crash in New York causes the worst economic crisis of the 20th century. Its impact is felt worldwide, with Germany not spared either, causing the unemployment rate to explode. Severely weakened, Germany sees a rise of nationalism in 1933 that allows the rise to power of the Nazi Party with Adolf Hitler at its helm. Despite the strict conditions imposed upon Germany after World War I, the new totalitarian regime resets the country and restores military service. The country also begins an aggressive foreign policy with the dream of uniting all German-speaking people. Italy, despite its victory with the Allies, is frustrated by the amount of territory it gained after World War I. Since 1922, the country is ruled by the dictatorial fascist party of Benito Mussolini. Italy begins a colonial policy by seizing Ethiopia and prepares a future invasion in Albania. In Spain begins 3 years of civil war opposing the Republican government supported by the USSR and the International Brigades and the nationalist camp led by Francisco Franco and aided by Italy and Germany. The two countries took the opportunity to test their armies and to get closer diplomatically. In Asia, Japan continues its expansionist policy. The country takes advantage of the civil war in China to invade new territories. The Japanese army uses chemical and biological weapons and commits massacres of populations. Germany is now powerful enough to launch its territorial expansion. It first annexed Austria with support from the local Nazi party. Next, the west of Czechoslovakia was invaded. The Slovak Republic becomes a German satellite state, while Hungary grows closer diplomatically. After the occupation of a part of Lithuania, Germany signs with the USSR a non-aggression pact and a plan to carve up Europe. It then attacks Poland, which provokes the United Kingdom and France to declare war, marking the beginning of World War II. Although the German forces are concentrated in the east, the Allied troops do not take initiative in the west. Instead, France and the United Kingdom try to cut the strategic iron ore route that passes through Norway and supplies the German military industry. Germany reacts by invading Denmark and Norway. Within days, the country captures Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Belgium. Hitler's new military strategy is called Blitzkrieg, which surprises opposition defenses with rapid, high-intensity attacks in a concentrated area. British forces retreat in the face of this German military prowess, and the German army bears down on Paris. The French army is defeated and an armistice is signed. Germany occupies the north and west of France, leaving its other territory and colonies under the control of the new government. Germany thus has indirect control of French colonies without having to send an army there. However, parts of the French colonies and the Belgian Congo chooses to stay in the camp of the Allies. In London, which already hosts several governments in exile, General Charles de Gaulle creates Free France, which continues to fight Nazi Germany. Brazzaville is named as its capital. Pursuant to the agreement signed with Germany, the Soviet Union seizes the Baltic states and a part of Romania. Germany, Italy and Japan combine to form the Axis powers. All dominions and British colonies, with the exception of Ireland, enter the war. In Africa, fighting begins between Italian colonies and Allied forces. While in Europe, despite the massive aerial bombing of British cities, Germany fails to take over the country. Hitler then changes his plans. He now wants to invade the USSR. But the plan is delayed by Italy, that fails to invade Greece and is forced to retreat by Allied forces. After the accession of Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria to the Axis forces, the German armies head south to invade Yugoslavia and Greece. Everywhere in Europe, the resistance is organized in different forms. Sometimes people organize strikes, demonstrations, or protect wanted persons. Some groups spy for the Allies, conduct sabotage, or print resistance newspapers. In Eastern Europe, guerrilla forces undermine the Axis armies. In Yugoslavia and Greece, resistant communists and royalist groups confront each other. Germany isn't spared the anti-Nazi resistance, with some attempts to assassinate Hitler, which fail. On June 22, Axis forces launched, on some counts, the largest military operation in history to attack USSR, which now passes de facto into the camp of Allied forces. The bulk of the German troops, well equipped and motorized, rush to the east. To support the Soviets, Allies occupy Iran, which then opens a supply route through the Caucasus. German armies arrive in Leningrad and begin a siege of the city that would last 872 days and cause more than 1 million civilian deaths. Further south, German troops were stopped at the gates of Moscow, where they suffer a harsh and deadly winter. Behind the front lines, the SS massacre Slavic and Jewish populations. In Asia, Japan occupies French Indochina. To counter its expansionist policy, the United States imposes upon it an embargo on oil and steel. In response, the Japanese conduct a surprise attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. A massive aerial bombing damages a large part of the US naval fleet. The United States enters the war on the Allied side. At first, they concentrate their forces on the Pacific front. The country also provides supplies to the USSR, which continues resisting the German advance. Japan, for its part, conquers new territories in the Pacific. In addition to the massacres, Japan sends 10 million Chinese civilians into forced labor camps. In Indonesia, millions of prisoners suffer the same fate on the island of Java. In Burma and Thailand, Allied prisoners are exhausted in the construction of a railway line. Moreover, hundreds of thousands of women are forcibly recruited into prostitution for the Japanese army. In Europe, concentration and extermination camps are built to massacre, among others, Jews, resistance fighters, political opponents, gypsies, homosexuals, and people with disabilities. Fearing a second front in Europe, Hitler built the Atlantic Wall, a series of military installations protecting the coast from invasion. But the Allies first landed in Morocco and Algeria. Italian Libya finds itself caught between the two fronts. Having lost control of its colonies, Vichy France is invaded. In the east, Axis forces try to cut the supply route of the Caucasus, but for the first time, the German offensive undergoes a major military setback. The Soviets take the initiative and counterattack. Africa is now entirely controlled by Allies who organize a landing in Sicily. The new Italian government requests an armistice, causing the Germans to invade. The USSR advances rapidly westward, forcing the German army to concentrate on that front. On June 6, 1944, the Allies land in Normandy. Their armies quickly take over and liberate Paris. In the west, as in the east, countries are liberated or switch camps. With victory in sight, Allied powers announced the creation of the United Nations. Countries that declared war on Germany and Japan would be admitted at its founding conference. This triggers a wave of declarations of war, but without major consequence. On April 30, Hitler commits suicide in his bunker just before the arrival of the Soviets. 8 days later, the country surrenders. The United States and USSR join forces to overcome the Empire of Japan. The Soviets begin a military invasion via Manchuria, while the US drops 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15, Japan surrenders, marking the end of World War II. After 6 years of war, the human toll is heavy, with at least 60 million dead, mostly civilians. Many cities are completely destroyed. Europe and the USSR subject millions of German prisoners of war to bonded labor, many of whom would die. Germany and Austria are carved up among the victors. The old guard of European powers are left exhausted and ruined by war. The United States and USSR emerge as the remaining global superpowers. Despite the role of the UN, which aims to maintain peace and international security, both sides would eventually engage in indirect confrontations around the world.
The consequences of World War II. In this video, we will examine the immediate consequences of World War II, the Nuremberg trials, the occupation of Japan and Germany, the birth of the United Nations, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The world after the war. The war had left Europe in ruins and had caused vast destruction in many parts of Asia and the Pacific. More than 50 million people died during the war, and many were injured. With Germany and Japan defeated, and France and Britain exhausted, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two major world powers. With the collapse of European powers, there was a sudden wave of decolonization, as the remaining British and French colonies in Asia and Africa started actively demanding their independence. Even the United States granted the Philippines its independence in 1946. As the war was closing, the world witnessed the destructive power of the atomic bomb and the lasting effects of radiation in the aftermath of the explosion. The US sought to continue the research and development of nuclear weapons, while the Soviet Union attempted to match the US nuclear capability as a top security concern. The result would be an arms race like no other. The Nuremberg Trials. The Allied liberation of the concentration camps revealed the extent of Nazi brutality and the horrible crimes committed during the war. The Allied nations sought to promote international justice by putting surviving Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity. Nazi leaders had individual responsibility for their crimes, even if they were following orders, or if the government had agreed with their despicable acts. An international tribunal was set up in the German city of Nuremberg between 1945 and 1946, with judges from the Allied nations hearing cases for 22 major Nazi war criminals. Most of them were convicted and sentenced to death or life in prison. Hermann Göring, one of the top Nazi officials and head of the Luftwaffe, was sentenced to death, but committed suicide just before the execution. Many Nazi criminals fled Germany to live abroad under new identities and never faced trial. Some of them even came to the United States. The occupation of Germany. After the war, all the territories that had been occupied by the Nazi regime during the war were returned, and Germany's eastern border was changed, with Poland and the Soviet Union gaining territory. The rest of Germany was occupied by the four Allied powers: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Each country established its own occupation zone, and the German capital, Berlin, was similarly divided into four different sectors. The Allied powers had the task of administering these territories, re-establishing services to the general population, and promoting education about the evils of Nazism to counter Nazi propaganda. The occupation of Japan and Korea. The United States occupied Japan right after the war. General MacArthur was placed in charge of rebuilding the country. Japan adopted a new constitution, becoming a democracy and renouncing the use of war and nuclear weapons. Under the peace agreement, Japan was forbidden to keep an army or a navy, except for peacekeeping purposes. The territories of the Japanese Empire were taken away, and its military leaders also faced trial. Korea, which had been ruled by Japan until 1945, was also occupied. The northern part of the Korean peninsula was occupied by the Soviet Union, while the southern part was occupied by the United States. The birth of the United Nations. Despite the failures of the League of Nations, the Allies were committed to form a new international organization for the purpose of international cooperation and peacekeeping. President Roosevelt was determined to ensure that the United States would participate, and diligently tried to avoid the mistakes of former President Wilson, Roosevelt worked hard to keep the Republican opposition in Congress informed and involved in the process. Roosevelt deemed the Soviet Union presence as a member as vital for the UN and constantly negotiated with Soviet leaders and diplomats. In 1942, 26 nations signed the United Nations Declaration, offering their support to the ideals of the Atlantic Charter. The U.S. Senate also recognized those ideals and called for the formation of new international peacekeeping organization in a 1943 resolution. Meanwhile, Roosevelt continued meeting with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin at the conferences in Tehran and Yalta, sharing his plans for the United Nations. In 1944, the Allied nations met at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, just outside Washington, D.C., and there they agreed on the general structure of the United Nations and its Security Council. From April to June 1945, delegations from 50 nations participated in the San Francisco Conference, where the United Nations Charter was completed. The U.S. delegation to the San Francisco Conference included African-American civil rights leader and founder of Bethune-Cookman College in Florida, Mary McLeod Bethune. McLeod had been a friend of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, as well as an important presidential advisor. President Truman appointed her as a delegate, as well as an advisor on interracial relations. McLeod was the only black female at the conference, as no other country had sent a woman of color as part of their delegation. Her work and contributions to the formation of the UN were vital. The United States became the first nation to sign the UN Charter in June 1945. The structure of the United Nations. The major aims of the United Nations are maintaining the peace and fostering friendship and cooperation among nations, as well as eliminating hunger, disease, and ignorance in the world. Even though the United Nations, just like the League of Nations, relies on the concept of collective security, the UN does have its own peacekeeping forces, contributed by the member nations. The UN General Assembly serves as the organization's main deliberative and representative organ. All member nations belong to the General Assembly. The UN Security Council conducts all peacekeeping and security operations. The Council has 5 permanent members, as well as 10 other member countries, which are elected every 2 years. The 5 permanent members, the United States, Great Britain, Russia, China, and France, enjoy special powers, including veto power over all UN peacekeeping operations. The Secretariat is the UN's administrative branch. The Secretariat is headed by the UN Secretary General, who acts as a leader and spokesperson for the organization. Other bodies in the United Nations include the International Court of Justice, based in The Hague in the Netherlands, and the Economic and Social Council, which encourages cooperation on economic and social matters. The UN also includes important institutions like the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, the WHO, or World Health Organization, the FAO, or Food and Agricultural Organization, and UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. All these institutions foster international cooperation and provide social and economic support for all of their members in times of need. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of the first acts of the UN's General Assembly was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, partly in response to the crimes and atrocities committed during the war. The Declaration, in its 30 articles, defines the rights to which all human beings are entitled. These rights include the right to life, the prohibition of slavery and torture, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, and freedom of association. Additionally, it also establishes social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to work, the right to an adequate standard of living, and the right to an education.